Chapter 421, OR. Scylla's gaze flickered as he looked at this quest. Honestly speaking, he had almost forgotten that he was in the middle of one. It was supposedly a legendary quest, but it didn't feel very legendary. However, that was only because of his own bias. After the first leg of the danger was made through, he had pretty much been able to ride that success to the very end. There was also the matter of Scylla's not quite understanding just where his place in the world was yet. In order to pass this quest, Scylla's had to not only rely on a legendary path talent in Extricate, he had to evolve his will to the tangible will realm, on top of having Rune Soul, a legendary mastery skill to rely upon, and an FFF comprehension combined with yet another legendary path talent that together allowed him to have a will that was 8 times more than the dungeon's requirement. Then, even after all of that, had he not had the ability to take the rewards out of the bonfire, he would have been stuck here for the rest of his life. To say that this was a legendary quest certainly wasn't an exaggeration. The problem was that Scylla's didn't seem to take close shaves with death all that seriously anymore, and even he subconsciously realized that this was a bit of an overcorrection. Those moments in the world of lava had been the lowest of his life. As a man who prided himself on his own discipline so much, to lose control of himself and his supposed ironclad will was a humiliation he would never forget. No one had been there to witness it, but he had never been someone who prided himself on the thoughts of others in the first place. He might be the only one who knows that such a thing happened, but he was also the most important person. Now, he made it a point to overcome those hurdles of life and death over and over again. Even though he had almost lost his life several times now. He felt nothing. Rewards. Greater than complete path of the Mansa chain quest. OR. Greater than unlocked dual class constitution. Scylla's didn't look at this screen for nearly as long as one might have thought he would have. He had made his decision in an instant. Without even much care, as though he wasn't giving up anything at all, and without so much as a question to the madness key, he chose the second route. He didn't feel the slightest regret. Choosing the first reward would have meant unlocking a legendary class instantly, not to mention removing the guillotine of failure over his head. However, for a long while now, Scylla's had constantly been picking future success over immediate gratification, and the reason for that was plainly obvious. The more difficult his route to power, the more effort he put in, the more chance he would have at circumventing the odds stacked against him. The Clipsians were such a powerful race of beings. Nosfaline was only level 6, yet she had several stats in the quadruple digits. She could simply mop the floor with most of the greatest powers of Earth right now. And yet, they were enslaved and forced into such a state. If it was the Sylphs who had managed this despite clearly being inferior in talent, it went to show just how powerful a great foundation was in this world. If it wasn't the Sylphs, and there was yet another power in the background making these moves. All the more reason he had to be even stronger. If he could benefit from 2 class upgrades per level instead of just 1, it would put him well on his way to this goal. But even now, he felt that it wasn't enough. He had to become stronger than even this. Otherwise, there was no way he'd be able to carry this burden on his own. At that moment, Scylla's body trembled. His pores opened up to the point his sharp gaze could quite literally see them. His blood began to boil and his muscles wreathed. It seems that this dual-class constitution isn't normal at all. The feeling wasn't uncomfortable. Rather, it was almost intoxicating. Once again, Scylla's found a certain object down below engorging itself, and this time he couldn't control it nearly so easily. It was only becoming more intense. After he learned he couldn't easily have a second comprehension, Scylla's came to understand that everything in this world was built on the back of genes. Classes were certainly no different. A dual-class constitution was something that only a very rare few were born with. The weakest race one could find such a thing in were D-grade races, and even then it was an exceptionally small number. Even at the C grade, it might only appear in 1 out of a few billion. Of course, this was across an entire universe where people could only be counted in the trillions upon trillions. But that didn't diminish its rarity in the slightest. To have a dual-class constitution meant having a special arrangement of genes that went beyond just allowing having a second class. Scylla's almost immediately felt several special things. First, his gene limit was doubled. Although this didn't apply to his stat limit as well, this was huge nonetheless. This meant that even without absorbing his gene crystal, his bronze gene limit had increased from just 2 all the way to 4, and his common gene limit had increased from 20 to 40. Just with this alone, his body would be in such a state of wealth should he max him out, of course that his natural healing factor, his ability to train effectively, and his clarity of mind would simply be on an entirely different level. It wasn't just this either. He had opened up more slots for gene talents, improved his capability in accepting them, and as though that wasn't enough. If he wanted to, he could integrate a second comprehension now even without the fusion crystal. Chapter 422, Dual Class Constitution. The feeling was hard to describe, and if not for Scylla's new understanding of his own body and great thanks to Rune Soul, he would have had a hard time putting his finger on exactly what was going on. But now, even without asking the madness key, he had a fairly good idea of all the benefits he was receiving, and he could only say that it was huge. Even the impact the unranked Grimblade lineage gene has on me has lessened considerably. My body feels like it's even more under my control, and if I started to train using the same methods I learned from Olivia, the results would be double with half the effort. Even before the summoning, those that were genetic phenomes were everywhere. Marathon runners all had off-the-charts aerobic fitness. The strongest men in the world had obscene bone density and muscle recovery times. The best sprinters, the highest jumpers, the strongest swimmers. Even if some of them might be accused of taking steroids, the reality was that no amount of steroids was going to take someone with inferior genetics to the Olympics. Even how the body reacted to steroids was a deciding factor in many of these sports. Some people could load themselves up on steroid cycles and not feel any adverse effects at all while reaping all the benefits, while someone else might be on the complete other side of the spectrum. If Scylla had to summarize how he was feeling now, it felt like he had suddenly firmly stepped into the realms of true genetic phenomes. At least compared to his fellow humans, despite still being of an F-grade race, he was simply on another tier. N-O-V-E-L-B-J-N.C, Out of curiosity, Scylla checked his gene state only to realize that it had been affected as well. Thanks to his merit leaderboard rewards, his gene state was flexible right now, giving him a 65% chance of absorbing any genes. While he still had a 65% chance and that hadn't changed, the duration of this gene state doubled. He had only had 2 days left in his flexible gene state, but now he very clearly had 4. This was to say that from now on, when he drank gene state elixirs, they would actually provide him with double the usual duration. Or in the case it had a set number of attempts like a few he had seen in the past, he would likely get double the chances to absorb a gene. Given the rarity of gene state elixirs, especially ones that could last for a significant period of time, this was huge. The last thing that Scylla felt was a loosening of a burden. This burden didn't come from the Grimblade lineage, but rather, interestingly enough, from his legendary profession and its 3 legendary paths. This change was probably what shocked Scylla the most. That was because he had never considered what it would mean for someone who couldn't even absorb silver genes to have a legendary profession in the first place. Everything in this world was built around genes, and there was no reason for his legendary profession to be any different. So where were all these genes? And what about him had changed to allow him to have a legendary profession in the first place? It was only now that Scylla realized that his body was actually a bottleneck for his legendary profession. Maybe the reason his understanding of the Basilisk King was so foggy was precisely because his body was so weak. Now that he thought about it, this wasn't the first time his body limited his profession. After all, according to his profession, he should be able to fuse with the Basilisk King for a full 8 minutes. But usually, his body began to break down long before he reached that point. It was only recently, when he had had a great deal of strength increase, that he could manage this a bit better. But there was no doubt that if he succeeded with the Basilisk King's next evolution, he might be right back to square one. This was just the most obvious example, but Scylla had never considered that there might be more subtle examples that he hadn't even considered. Like the intuition talent of his one-kind for me path. Maybe it wasn't that his understanding of Nosphaline's path was so great, but rather that in comparison to the Basilisk King it was so much more clear that he was under the illusion that he knew a lot about her. But now, after awakening the dual-class constitution, he felt that his previous understanding of the mesmerics was a joke. He didn't just have a Cliff Notes understanding of the mesmerics in his mind now, he practically had a full catalogue in comparison to what he had grasped before. Suddenly he realized that if his legendary path wasn't limited, maybe he would know every possible detail about any serpentis he threw a casual glance at. The more Silas thought through these matters, the more certain he was that he had made the right choice. Even if all he gained was a chance to accept a second class, he would be satisfied. But to gain all of these unexpected benefits on top of it was more than just a cherry on top. These were the things he would need in order to accomplish what he wanted to. Finally, the metamorphosis of his body settled down. Unfortunately, his body was covered from head to toe in impurities and there was no easy method to clean himself off. Though he liked to be clean, he had no choice but to ignore this. It wasn't like he was in the best of states before anyway. Now it was time to take a look at his other rewards. Since he already knew that it would be useless to him, he popped the armor bubble first and couldn't help but sigh when he read it. Stats. Maybe if things go well with Nosfaline I can just give it to her. Chapter 423, Frostbane Treasures. Frostbane Armor, Bronze, Treasure, Level 1. Plus 100 Constitution. Ability, Frostbane Zone. Absorb Frostbane Ether to repair armor. Exude area of effect in less than 1 meter radius that deals less than 1 ice poison damage per second when activated at the cost of 1 durability per minute. Durability, 10 out of 10. Despite being a step below the basilisk skin armor in grade, Silas might even argue that this armor was better. To have both a self-repair function and an AoE attack built in was simply huge. Silas had already lost several weapons due to durability, and would only lose more in the future. He couldn't use his kunai anymore because one more attempt would probably break them. He had just lost Azrael's sword not long ago, and even the stabilizing bracelet, after so many uses, was beginning to take some nicks. He would have to be really cautious with how he used it in the future. The obvious trade-off was that its innate defense fell off a cliff and likely didn't scale very high either. But even so, unless he leveled up the basilisk skin armor to ridiculous levels, he would probably prefer this armor due to its versatility. Plus, when you took into account the fact that the basilisk skin armor was silver grade, and would certainly require silver grade genes to continue to level up in the future, you would have an obvious position trade-off that couldn't be denied. Unfortunately, all of that was worthless since he couldn't use it. The silver lining was that maybe Nosfaline could use it in the future, but he wasn't yet certain if that would be possible. If things went well, then Nosfaline would probably lose her humanoid form and thus the ability to use this armor in the first place. I'll make use of it somehow. I'll also have to find a method of getting my equipment repaired. Unfortunately, his dual-class constitution didn't seem to extend to dual profession. But even if it did, he wouldn't even know how to go about getting the needed profession in the first place. Obviously, he had stumbled onto his Vipermancer profession completely by accident, and he wasn't even sure if he'd have the necessary time to give to another. Shaking his head, Silas moved on to the second reward. It was a fruit that looked almost like a white-blue peach. Its surface was fuzzy like the fruit, but because of its odd color it looked more like an ornament to be placed in the middle of a dinner table rather than actually being part of the dinner. That said, the description more than made up for its slightly inedible appearance. Frostbane fruit, silver, consumable. Advance ice poison affinity by 1 grade up to silver grade. Silas' gaze flashed. This fruit was perfect for him. Right now, his ice poison affinity was only common. It was only thanks to Rune Soul that he could control his slow and freeze ice poison runes at all. However, because his affinity was too low and his body couldn't handle it, he hadn't been able to swap his ether out with this more powerful version. Due to this, casting his mutant skills cost more ether and sapped up a great deal of his wisdom as well. If he had had a higher ice poison affinity, he wouldn't have suffered nearly so much after his dungeon had been tampered with. Silas didn't hesitate to take a bite into the fruit. Nothing happened, so he continued to eat until he had swallowed the entire thing, even the seed in the middle. It was surprisingly good. Though the fruit looked beautiful, he hadn't expected to enjoy the taste so much. It was almost a bit spritzy like a carbonated drink, but it had a natural sweetness to it that refined sugars couldn't match. After the seed hit his stomach, Silas finally began to feel the changes. A cool energy pulled through his ether pathways and his body felt like it was floating on air. That was when something surprising happened. According to the description of the fruit, he should have only been able to progress his affinity from common to bronze. But to his surprise, His dual-class constitution seemed to have acted again, progressing it to the peak the fruit would allow and granting him a silver-grade affinity. It was yet another pleasant surprise. It seemed that even the medicinal properties of fruits and maybe even elixirs would go further thanks to his new constitution. Silas looked at his hand and was surprised to find it almost sparkling. He had always taken care of himself in the past, but it was hard to do so when something was trying to kill you every other hour. Because of that, his skin care had lagged behind, and it certainly didn't help that he was covered from head to toe in his own impurities right now. But to his surprise, the fruit came with a sort of cleansing effect that froze over those impurities and shattered them into a sparkling rain. That exposed his skin underneath, which now looked even more soft and almost supple compared to what it had been before the summoning. Fascinating. Silas raised a hand to his head to check something and was thankful that all his hair was still there. Though, it was getting a little long now. I'll also need to do something about my clothes, and vel.bjn.c. The rags he was wearing had also shattered into shards of ice, leaving him entirely naked. His main problem was that unlike everyone else, he could only wear the most ordinary of clothing, leaving them vulnerable to things like this. Silas took a breath and swapped out his ether, feeling a thrumming sensation run through his body as he felt even more powerful. Now, his ether skin also came with double the defense. This would be a huge advantage in battle. Finally, he turned his attention to the second to last item. It was a scroll, and when he popped the bubble, he realized that it was actually a skill. In fact, it was a skill type he had been meaning to get for the longest time. A movement type skill. Unfortunately, I can't use this. Frostbane Escape, FFF, race skill. Deconstruct the body into frostbane runes and reappear in any location with less than 10 meters with sufficient frostbane ether concentration. Note: limited to elemental races. Chapter 424, Everything. Frostbane Escape, FFF, race skill. Deconstruct the body into frostbane runes and reappear in any location with less than 10 meters with sufficient frostbane ether concentration. Note: limited to elemental races. Silas sighed. This technique should be similar to something that Vayu had used. During their battle, he shattered into a rain of ice and then appeared near him, almost catching Silas off guard. However, Silas had luckily been able to grasp where he would appear thanks to Rune Soul. He had been very interested in this technique, and this skill even seemed to be an upgraded version of it, but unfortunately he didn't have the body composition to use it. The Sylphs were certainly an elemental race, whatever that meant. But humans very obviously weren't. He would have to find a way to change his race, upgrade it, or maybe use another method entirely if he wanted to make use of this skill. Either way, he wasn't going to have such a chance now. Shaking his head, Silas could only put the skill away. For now, he didn't learn it. Who knew, maybe there would be an opportunity to sell it in the future. Or maybe he could study the runes of the skill to figure something else out. Silas had a feeling, though, that most movement skills related to his current class would probably require this sort of thing. Ice Poison was unlikely to have an ability like less than Shadow Warp greater than. That meant that he would likely need to find a skill unrelated to his Arctic Royal class. Maybe. Silas' thoughts drifted to slow and freeze. He might be thinking of things too simply, but whether he would get a chance to take such a step. Only time would tell. Plus, if he could manage to find a worthy chance at a second class, then it might cover his weaknesses regardless. Since Arctic Royal was so heavily defense and control focused, it would be nice if his second class had more explosive attack abilities. But he wouldn't snub his nose at a movement and evasion type if its grade was high enough. Silas turned his attention to the final award. It was odd because it looked like a feather carved from ice. It was even more beautiful than the white blue peach from earlier, and so delicate he was hesitant to even reach out and touch it. When he popped the bubble, something surprising happened. The ice feather fluttered in the air. Frostbane Feather, Silver, Consumable Treasure. Sacrifice to trigger upgrade in mount or combat mount, or turn beast into mount or combat mount, mutate or replace ether affinity. Improve grade to FFF. Note: function of consumable treasure will depend on the gene constitution of target beast. More control will be granted depending on brand grade. Uses left, 1/1. What an interesting treasure. It was the first consumable treasure that Silas had ever seen, but more importantly than that, it seemed to have a wide range of outcomes. It didn't specify whether you would be able to turn a normal beast into a mount or combat mount, and it didn't specify what it meant by mutate or replace either. Silas could make some extrapolations of his own, but nothing was absolutely certain, and it made it quite fascinating. Especially this mention of branding. It seemed that he had to leave a mark of some sort on the feather so that when he used it, the mount or combat mount created would be recognized as his own. Clearly, a hidden function of this treasure was to also do the taming process on his behalf. In the right situation, this could actually save his life and net him the perfect mount at the same time. Improved to FFF grade. That's also a bit odd. What if the beast is stronger than that? Would it just not work? Or would it forcefully decrease the strength of the beast? The Frostbane feather was a silver grade treasure, but it only allowed one use to create an FFF mount. There had to be a reason for that. It seemed that he would just have to find out the hard way. Silas took a breath and exhaled. He wasn't in a rush to use this Frostbane feather. Like he had said to Kasari, he technically did have a combat mount already. It was just a little less convenient in some ways, but also far more convenient in others. If he got a real combat mount, he would have to learn how to fight while on the back of a beast. By comparison, just fusing and gaining the necessary stats, or sending out the Basilisk King to fight on his behalf without having to mount it, was far more flexible. Knowing that, Silas had a very clear target. If he was going to use this feather, it had to be a combat mount that had strong defenses or area control, and most importantly, could fly. The convenience of having such a creature would help him tremendously, not just in combat, but to escape combat should he need to. Now, he would just have to find a large bird beast to target. With that thought, he stored the Frostbane feather into his madness key. The rewards this time were great, though two of them were useless to him for now. He was only supposed to have received one of these rewards, so it was bound to be good stuff regardless. If he had only had one chance, and had gotten the armor out of it, there would be no room to regret. Is that everything? Silas looked around again and nodded. I see. The reason they probably wanted to fight it out should be for the Frostbane fruit. They were all level 9, and having high Frostbane affinity before their class acceptances would have been a huge boon to them. But it's still odd that it was done in teams of 10, then. Were the others not supposed to get anything out of this? Silas had only just had the thought when a pressure descended from above. His expression couldn't help but change. He did not want to level up right now. Chapter 425, Blossom. Silas could feel what was coming immediately. It was likely that this rush was going to help him to level up quickly. In fact, he might gain as much as 20 or 30 levels in one go. This blessing was supposed to be something that was passed between 40 or so individuals with various degrees of help. But not only was Silas in a team on his own, he was the only team that had even made it here to begin with. With this sort of baptism, he could probably make it to level 50 in a single go. However, that was the absolute last thing he wanted right now. He subconsciously staved off the mature ether, using a combination of his own ether skin and rune soul, but the pressure was greater than anything he could have ever expected. Damn it. Silas' gaze flickered. He realized already that he couldn't do this indefinitely. He would end up folding eventually, and by that point, he might as well have accepted the entire blessing. Should he just accept it? Having the entire thing was better than failing in the last stretch and only managing to grasp a tiny part of it. If he was going to level up anyway, he might as well make it to level 50 in a single go. Silas was under no delusions that he would be able to build this perfect foundation at level 0, making himself comparable to the strongest races in the universe. His starting point was too low and he knew that. This was why he had promised himself that he would start to level up when his progress stalled too much. But now wasn't the time. He had just made such massive gains, and he had been about to check if he had the 200 genes he needed to complete his 200 capacity gene crystal. There was still so much room to grow, he didn't want to ruin everything now. And yet, he was now facing off against something that anyone would die to have but he wanted no part of. No, there has to be a way to divert it. Silas thought about the Basilisk King, but he dismissed it. This blessing was tailored to those with frostbane affinity. It would likely kill his basilisk. Nosfaline was an even worse option. She would collapse the moment she left the hibernation realm, first of all. And on top of that, he wasn't yet sure if she had frostbane affinity. She might just be more capable than most in resisting the cold thanks to her mental stats. Suddenly Scylla's gaze flashed as he recalled something. Without hesitation, he brought out the mance's wand. By now, it was already beginning to lose some of its luster, having not been able to absorb ice poison ether in so long. In fact, if things continued like this, it would likely revert back to its original form. The mance's wand had no particular affinity. It was capable of working with any and all parts of the mancer. That meant that it was able to morph as the situation allowed. However, it also gave Scylla an idea. He was able to learn so much from the mance's wand after absorbing fringe ice poison ether from the outskirts of the Arctic Emperor's territory. What if he had the mance's wand absorb ether capable of leveling up a person to level 50? Would he have a clear path to understand ice poison to the very ends of the F grade? Scylla inwardly crossed his fingers, hoping the mance's wand could withstand so much energy. And this time, he wasn't disappointed. The mance's wand began to greedily swallow up the ether in the surroundings. Under Scylla's guidance, it didn't hold back in the slightest. Scylla realized the might of a silver-grade treasure at that moment. The mance's wand didn't have an obvious method of leveling up, at least not like the other legendary path treasures he had seen. Mance's wand, silver, treasure. The paths of the mancer are long and complex. There is no one path that is superior to another, but the distance one can travel depends greatly on your strength of heart. The mancer's wand allows you to feel and sense your path of the mancer, how to progress it and how to improve it. How far you can see down this road will be decided by your own personal insight. He couldn't seem to use genes to upgrade it like he had seen before. But who was to say that it was incapable of leveling up at all? Or maybe, because it was only temporarily able to maintain such a level, it couldn't be considered a permanent level up. Regardless, Scylla found himself in awe of just how much ether it was absorbing, and just how much ether a level 50 would have. It pulled together in such a thick concoction that it nearly liquefied. At the same time, the mancer's wand began to grow, becoming much more like a staff. And then from a staff, it seemed to root itself in the air, becoming much more like a crystalline tree, exuding gorgeous colors. Scylla's eyes narrowed. He would be a fool if he didn't realize that something unexpected was happening. In fact, he was only saying level 50 because of assumptions on his part. He had no idea if this ether would cause him to fall far short of level 50, or still be too much to absorb even if he did reach level 50. But what was clear was that the mancer's wand was evolving. Soon, it had grown from a wand to a small tree about Scylla's height. It wasn't just this, but it began to bud, forming a few fruits on its body. Mancer's blossom, silver, ether treasure. The paths of the mancer are long and complex. There is no one path that is superior to another, but the distance one can travel depends greatly on your strength of heart. The mancer's blossom allows you to feel and sense your path of the mancer, how to progress it and how to improve it. Feed the mancer's blossom ether and it will bear fruit to enlighten your path. Meditate beneath the mancer's blossom to improve ether recovery and gain a chance to level up. Chapter 426, Crack. Mancer's blossom, silver, ether treasure. The paths of the mancer are long and complex. There is no one path that is superior to another, but the distance one can travel depends greatly on your strength of heart. The mancer's blossom allows you to feel and sense your path of the mancer, how to progress it and how to improve it. Feed the mancer's blossom ether and it will bear fruit to enlighten your path. Meditate beneath the mancer's blossom to improve ether recovery and gain a chance to level up. Scylla was pleasantly surprised by the change. Although the grade didn't change, there was no doubting that the treasure, or rather the ether treasure, was a huge boost to what it had been before. This was what Scylla had realized long ago. Unless all the variables were the same, it was unlikely for two silver-grade treasures to be perfectly identical. The silver-grade frostbane feather was a bit lackluster compared to its silver-grade counterpart, only able to create an FFF-grade combat mount at best. By the same token, this silver-grade mancer's blossom was clearly far more valuable. Scylla exhaled a slow breath. He had managed to slip away from trouble this time around and had even made another gain. The question was, Will it be ready to put into the madness key? Silas had already seen that he couldn't put living people into the ring. He hadn't had the chance to see whether he could put living plants and such inside. It should be fine. He felt like he was worrying too much about it. Instead, he shifted his focus to his gene crystal. One after another, he took out several corpses and began to assess the number of genes that he had gathered. Etherflow, F. Silver gene. Raise genetic limit to 20, bronze genes of a kind or 1, silver gene of a kind, raise stat limit to 500 relative stat units. Gene talents, Etherflow, F. Etherflow. Ether comes naturally to you, even when it's outside of your body. Your ability to extend your ether away from your core, attaching it to objects to control and wield, far exceeds others. You have now reached a new step of mastery. +8 intelligence, +8 charisma, silver, greater than requirements to unlock, silver. 22, strength, constitution, dexterity, speed, wisdom, 44, charisma. 44, intelligence. 1, basic Etherflow, 1, less than Mitchcraft title, FFF plus, title. After some time and much more experience, Silas had landed on choosing Etherflow despite Rune Flow and Skill Flow being enticing in their own right. Rune Flow. Ether comes naturally to you, even when it's outside your body. The runes of the world are your conduit and the laws, abstruse and untouchable to others, come to you of their own volition, Skill Flow. Ether comes naturally to you, even when it's outside your body. Layer your skill, cast multiple at once, and even instant cast. The limitations of others do not apply to you. In the end, he felt like upgrading Etherflow was his best choice, especially since it was the one he had fulfilled the most obscure requirements for. He had already gathered the Mitchcraft title he needed, and he obviously carried basic Etherflow with him wherever he went. Beyond this, however, he felt that the other two were either redundant or didn't synergize with him as well. Rune Flow just sounded like an inferior version of his Rune Soul, or rather, what he thought to be an upgraded Rune Breath. And in fact, he was right. Even with Rune Breath, he could control runes about as well as Rune Flow would have allowed him to. With Rune Soul, he was leagues beyond. At best, what he would be getting out of it was the stat boost. By comparison, Skill Flow was harder to dismiss. But the issue was that the current stack of skills that Silas had couldn't really be used in layers, stacks, or benefit very much from double casts or more. Skills like Less Than Arctic King's Domain or Less Than Arctic Halmatanthe were best cast once with proper timing. Even the skills that would benefit from such a thing were minimal. The only such skill in his arsenal right now that would fit the bill was Less Than Chilling Scythe Mutant Greater Than, but it was less than average among attack skills, and choosing this unique gene just for it was an aggressive waste of his time and resources. If he had a class that focused more on attacks, or he had a wider variable range of attack options, Skill Flow might be more worth it. But since he was so loaded with control and defensive skills, it was worthless to the current him. That left Etherflow. It was the ability he probably used the absolute most in combat now, and an upgrade to it would certainly bring him to an entirely new level. This time when he returned to the Grimblades, he would be more than prepared for anything that was thrown his way. There are 23 of each physical gene and 29 of each mental gene from the Sylphs. The Clipsians are the true boon. There are 26 of each of the physical genes, and 32 of each of the mental genes from them, even though they had fewer of them. That's 411 total bronze genes. I have enough to try the gene crystal twice. And I haven't even looked at the level 35 gene core yet. Silas' gaze flashed when he had this thought. The gene crystal was cracked due to his earlier escapades, but it should be able to be used at least a handful more times so long as he wasn't continuously using extricate on it. If he was lucky enough. Silas began to load up the gene crystal. As he did so, he realized that he wouldn't have the luxury to use the gene crystal twice like he wanted. That was because he was going to have to sacrifice his title and basic Etherflow for this. Meaning, he would only get one shot. In that case, he would have no choice but to sacrifice the gene crystal. Crack. Chapter 427, 999. Silas stood with a stoic calmness as he sacrificed the gene crystal. He had had fantasies of using the gene crystal twice with the number of genes that he had accumulated. Thanks to his dual-class constitution, if the first unique gene succeeded, his 1 silver gene limit would become 2, and he would be able to absorb another silver gene. Although Rune Flow and Skill Flow weren't the right match for him, right now he had a ton of potential templates he could use. There was Winter's Edge, Rune Soul, he could even use his Slow or Freeze Ice Poison rune. However, in the end, he felt that he had already taken too many risks. If he lost his title without gaining it back, his wisdom would plummet off a cliff. But even worse than that, losing basic Etherflow would halve his combat potential. It was an unacceptable risk. Although he had a 65% chance of succeeding, that was a 35% chance of failing. Odds larger than 1/3 weren't something he was willing to gamble on. He would rather the surefire chance even if that meant he couldn't use Extricate on it. Plus, there was a silver lining to all of this. If he didn't use the remaining over 200 bronze genes, he would be able to load up his genes and his stats. Scylla's body trembled and a familiar yet foreign feeling filled him as his genes were rearranged. He observed the changes as the silver gene integrated with him, and for a moment, there was a flashbang that went off in his mind. He realized that even if he didn't use Extricate directly, the sensory amplification of Rune Soul and this legendary path talent was such that it was effectively the same. He felt every moment of his stat limit increasing to 500. Of his bronze gene limit increasing to 20. And then to 40 shortly afterwards. And most clearly of all, he felt new tiers open up to him. Silver genes. Now, he had space not for just one, but two. Experiencing the first silver gene himself, Silas realized just how far the gap was. It was a complete and qualitative change, one so large that even Extricate couldn't quite put a neat bow on it. Name, Silas Grimblade. Species, Human, F. Affiliation, Grimblade lineage. Class, Arctic Royal, fragmented. Class. Profession, Vipermancer, FFF+. Level, 0. Coins, 2133-222, F. Titles. Physical. Mental, 517. Greater than Intelligence, 427. Greater than Wisdom, 844. Greater than Charisma, 280. Will, 872. Luck, 22. Silas was a bit surprised. His title, Skill Savant, granted him plus 100% intelligence. Because of that, the plus 80 intelligence that Etherflow gave him became 160, and that resulted in his mental stat going over his new 500-point stat limit. Usually when that happened he would feel a great deal of pain. But this time, he only felt the same comfort. It must be because of my dual-class constitution. I can break through stat limits more easily now and at the cost of less pain. It's even comfortable. The more he experienced from this new constitution, the more he felt that he had made the right decision. With that thought, he began to load up his bronze genes until they were filled to the brim with what he had on hand. At the same time, his body felt like it was rippling with vitality and strength. Name, Silas Grimblade. Species, Human, F. Affiliation, Grimblade lineage. Class, Arctic Royal, fragmented. Class. Profession, Vipermancer, FFF+. Level, 0. Coins, 2133-222, F. Titles, A Tangible Will, System Breaker, Legendary Tamer, Surge of the Die, Baron of Gwiz, Skill Savant, FFF+, Madness Conqueror, FF, Common Arts Enthusiast, F, A Patient Stalker, F, Physical, 500. Greater than Strength, 500. Greater than Constitution, 500. Greater than Dexterity, 500. Greater than Speed, 500. Mental, 517. Greater than Intelligence, 427. Greater than Wisdom, 844. Greater than Charisma, 280. Will, 999. Luck, 22. Skills, Madness Control, FF+, Basic Scouting, F, Maddened Enlightenment, FF+, Astral Bind, F+, Momentum Shift, F+, Solidify, F+, Master Scouting, FFF, Stunning Spike, FF, Astral Wolfishin, FF, Mirror Step, FF, Psychedelic Punch, FF, Arctic King's Domain, FFF, Master Counter, FFF, Arctic Howl Mutant, FF+, Chilling Scythe Mutant. FF+. Comprehensions, Madness, FFF. Gene State, flexible. Fragmented genes, Grimblade lineage, F, voice of a king, F. Common genes, 20, strength, F, 20, constitution, F, 20, dexterity, F, 20, speed, F, 20, intelligence, F, 20, wisdom, F, 20, will, F. Bronze genes, enchanted scribe, F, 17, strength, F, 17, constitution, F, 17, dexterity, F, 17, speed, F, 17, intelligence, F, 39, wisdom, F, 17, charisma, F, 40, will, F. Silver genes, Etherflow, F. Gene talents, Blade Aura, unranked, Sudden Burst, F, Tail Whip, F, Winter's Edge, FFF, Etherflow, FF+. Silas took his time to use Extricate on each and every one of his new genes. Even when he felt like there were diminishing returns to the Enlightenment, he did so anyway, feeling the shock and awe that it could bring him, and the deeper understanding of his stats that came with it. But to his shock, his will actually reached a bottleneck at 999. Silas had noticed that his will would have a stat limit long ago, but he had continued trudging along without ever running into it. But now he suddenly had. Now that he thought about it, despite having mental stats that were all in the ridiculously high quadruple digits, Nosphaline's will had been at 997. Was that a coincidence, or was 999 a universal cap to everyone? He had a ridiculous 20 common will genes and 40 bronze will genes, and a dual-class constitution, on top of having a tangible will, but he couldn't break through this stat limit. Something about that felt off. Now that he thought about it, he had never run into anyone with a will stat past 999. Other than himself when he fused with the Basilisk King. He subconsciously made a move to ask the Madness Key about it, only to freeze moments later. A taboo. This. Silas felt an anger he had already suppressed on this will challenge rising up again. Someone was messing with his will. He had never pegged himself as someone with a reverse scale, but if he were to ever have one, it would be this. He didn't like the idea of will being a stat at all. That was already touching his bottom line. But will manipulation. That was absolutely unacceptable to him. Chapter 428, Extricate LV5. Silas stood in silence for a long while before he managed to settle his emotions. The indifference on his face practically became etched in stone as he stood in a stoic sort of silence. All he could swear was that he would one day figure all of this out. After a breath, Silas didn't make a move to leave just yet. Instead, he turned his attention to his 20,000 free experience points and put half of them directly into Taboo Bond. By now, he had already realized that Taboo Bond would maybe be his greatest reliance in the future. If he got a chance to upgrade it, he should take it. Even if it was once. The result, though, deviated from his expectations. Taboo Bond. Level, 5. Experience, 0.20,000. Path Talent, Extricate LV5. Extricate Path Talent. Greater than Extricate less than F rank Gold Genes. Greater than Extricate less than F rank Common Gene Talents. Silas calmed quickly. He realized that he should have expected such a change to begin with. It had to be remembered that the cost to upgrade from LV3 Extricate to LV4 had only required 800 total experience. But the cost from LV4 to LV5 had jumped by more than 10 times. It was only natural that there would be a qualitative change of sorts, and clearly that was represented here. Unfortunately, the experience cost had begun to double again, but this could only be expected as well. There was no doubt that into the future, Taboo Bond would be by far his most expensive legendary path to upgrade. But the results were more than worth it. The question is, what does it mean by common gene talent? Silas had only ever seen gene talents between Fand FFF, could it be that they were all considered common? The only way to see was to test it on himself, so he did exactly that. He turned his new and improved Extricate talent on himself and started to probe around. As expected, he found that he had the ability to extricate every one of his gene talents. It seemed that all of these gene talents were considered to be common. The ranking systems of the, system had always been confusing. But ever since he learned that the current system was just a slapped-together version of an older model and a new one, he began to accept it more. However, every time he came across a situation like this one, it made him realize that something truly big must have happened in the past. By almost all metrics, the old system seemed to be better. The FTO FFF Plus ranking seemed to always be below the bronze to legendary standards, and it made one wonder if the creation of this new system caused the loss of a great number of abilities of the past. Maybe in some sense, but I can't help but notice that Taboo Bond always starts at common grade as though it doesn't know a fragmented grade exists. It's possible that in the past, while the ceiling was much higher, the floor was much lower as well. If that is the case, this new system might be much more forgiving than the old one once was. Silas wasn't sure of the truth and was just speculating, but he also had no skin in this competition of new and old. All he cared about was what would make him the strongest. He would use both if he had to. Just as he was about to use his remaining experience on either one kind for me or a fourth invincible, he paused as he realized something. I might not be able to get away with extricating the Grimblade lineage gene, but can't I extricate the Blade Aura gene talent? Maybe that will make me feel better. After having this thought, Silas tried it out. It seems tied to the Grimblade lineage. It would be very difficult to separate them without them coming out together. The Blade Aura gene talent only came from the existence of the Grimblade lineage gene. This was clearly different from a gene talent that existed on its own. However, from Silas' understanding, there was no gene talent that truly did exist on its own. A gene talent was like a net that caught a bunch of smaller genes to make them work together to meet its ends. This was why using a new gene talent required so much aerobic fitness. It was almost like doing a completely new exercise for the first time. This meant that if his extricate talent allowed him to pull gene talents out in the first place, there was no reason for it not to work this time. As expected, Silas tugged just a little harder and he felt the unranked gene talent separate from his body. All of a sudden, he felt several times lighter. And when he checked his stats, he was surprised to find that all of his physical stats had actually increased by 20. His power surged again and it was almost like a wet cloth was removed from his mouth. He could breathe, truly breathe. Silas looked down at his palm to find an amalgamation of twisting runes. He could see that it was broken in several locations, but it was also far too complex for him to fix. To think that the problem was mostly this gene talent and not the Grimblade lineage itself. Silas had an inkling of what happened. Back then, his stat limit had been 50, as opposed to around 25 to 30 like most people, thanks to the Grimblade lineage. But he had also speculated that the stat limit of the Grimblade heirs might be even higher. Now, he had definitely confirmed that. His first stat limit had increased from 50 to 70, and that was why his stats had suddenly just taken a leap. If he was correct, the level 0 stat limit of the Grimblade heirs was probably closer to 200 or maybe even more. However, this also meant that Silas couldn't just casually take the Grimblade lineage out of his body. It was best he find a gene crystal he could use that would swallow it up and replace it with a more perfect version. Or else rather than his stats increasing like now, they would plummet instead. Chapter 429, The Last Piece. Excellent. Silas was happy with the results. At the same time, he was wondering if it was finally about time to invest in improving this Grimblade lineage he was born with. No matter what direction his class was taking him in, because he had Grimblade blood flowing through his veins, he was also aware that the foundation of his body was set in a completely different direction. After analyzing Nosphaline's body thoroughly, Silas realized that the stuff he was playing around with right now was only surface level. If he truly wanted to reach his highest potential, he would either need to find methods of digging far deeper than he was now, or he would have to roll with what he was already born with. For now, he wasn't opposed to doing either. Although the system said his last name was Grimblade, he had always thought of himself as Silas Brown. Still, that didn't mean he was averse to using his Grimblade blood to benefit himself. Anything otherwise would be the pinnacle of foolishness, and he prided himself in avoiding that sort of thing. Silas thought about using his free experience points once again before just dismissing the idea and choosing to save them. Truthfully, he didn't feel the need to upgrade either of the other two for now, and being halfway to his next Taboo Bond upgrade sounded far more appealing. Instead, he took out the various spatial devices and treasures he had gathered and began to take inventory. It was about time he did so. After going through everything, he eventually settled on the level 35 gene core. Earthbound Serpent, FFF. Genes detected. Silver genes, 5 constitution, F. Attempt assimilation. Yes, no. The system doesn't tell me about gene talents until I attempt the assimilation myself. But Silas reached forward with his senses, activating madness and less than master scooting until he found what he was looking for. Earthen roots. It was another FF gene, and this one was a surprising mirror of Winter's Edge. The function of Winter's Edge was quite simple. It could separate and isolate ice-related ether and runes in the air. And second, it could sharpen them to a point, allowing one to control a blizzard of blades. Essentially, it automated what Silas might have to usually do with his rune soul, and took a step beyond. It could change the nature of the ice and give it far more piercing power. If Silas had to describe it, it was about the same as a treasure with plus 50% piercing power, or in other words, it made strength about 50% more effective, giving 100 strength the piercing power equivalent of 150 strength. The good of Winter's Edge was that it finally shored up one of Silas' main weaknesses, that being attack strength. The bad news was that he could hardly use it for a few seconds. Originally, he had gotten Winter's Edge as a trump card for this dungeon, but not everything worked out the way you wanted it to. He ended up faring better when he didn't use it. Though, it had been a bit useful on the Will Challenge stairs because of the added control over the ether in the surroundings. But not being able to use it for long really hampered him. An FF gene talent was the equivalent of an FF skill at Legendary Mastery. Winter's Edge also scaled with his intelligence, which was currently 427. That meant that without any outside input, a single burst of Winter's Edge could easily do about 700 or so attack damage. The best part was that it was continuous, doing that kind of damage at least once every couple of seconds. It was even possible that if he mastered it enough to the point he wasn't gasping for breath after a handful of seconds, he might be able to incorporate some poison aspects as well. Unfortunately, the drawbacks were also obvious, and he had a feeling that Earthen Root would be similar. When he said that Earthen Root was a perfect mirror of Winter's Edge, he meant it. It worked the same, separating the Earth-type ether from the air and using it. But this time, rather than an act of attack, it was one of defense. Earthen Root, though, was a little more forgiving. It would add the Earth ether directly to his ether skin, and he would be able to maintain it for at least a few minutes at a lower cost than what it would take to trigger it. However, this is the last piece. Silas' intuition talent flashed the moment he touched it. The 450 capacity gene talent crystal. The basilisk skin armor. This gene core. Those were the 3 pieces he needed to help the Basilisk King evolve once again. He had known that he needed just one more piece, but he didn't expect that he would be handed that piece by the enemies of Earth. Realizing this, Silas chose to store away the gene core instead of absorbing the talent, though it would surely help him. Compared to having this gene talent that would have him gasping for breath, what if he could have a bronze-grade beast to call out to battle with him? With the increase to his stats, he could definitely fuse with a far more powerful Basilisk King without issues now. And even if he couldn't, if this evolution allowed the Basilisk King to become a bronze-grade beast, he might not even have to do any fighting personally at all. According to the Madness Key, bronze beasts, true ones and not quasi-ones like he had fought twice until now, were existences it took entire armies to bring down. If the Basilisk King became so strong, he wouldn't even need to waste time gathering new creatures to use. It seemed that he would have to return to Castlemaine first before going back to the Grimblades. That should be everything. Silas looked toward the blooming tree and placed it inside of the Madness Key. Luckily he was correct and there didn't seem to be any problems. However, he could also tell that the tree was a bit restrained and suffocated. I'll have to find a better vessel for it. Let's go. Silas manipulated the runes of the bonfire to step out. But when he did, he found an airship waiting in the skies for him. Orion and Aeroina. Chapter 430, Internal Struggles. Silas looked to the skies, his expression calm. For some reason, he felt a great deal of pressure when he met Orion's gaze, but that didn't cause him to falter. Instead, he calmly looked to the side where he found Brisa, who still seemed to be steaming from how things ended. Not only had she lost 2 valuable items, but she hadn't even been able to make it to the end. However, she also didn't dare to blame Silas for it either. For her to lose on time was something that she still couldn't wrap her head around. Just how strong did Silas have to be to accomplish such a thing? Had they let him win? No, that was impossible as well. Even if they came from the same world, the chains of the system affected them all equally. Of course, they had yet to confirm that Silas was from Earth. As of now, they were still in the dark about exactly which of the summoned worlds he came from. So Brisa felt that this was actually even less likely. After sweeping his gaze through everyone, Silas seemed to realize something and then indifferently turned his attention to the bonfire. His eyes narrowed when he saw the corpse of the old man, and certain things he had guessed earlier were confirmed. Inwardly, however, he felt that this was actually quite good for him. So the Sylphs have such internal struggles. Good. Weaknesses of the enemies were positives to him. If there was such a clash, he could take advantage of it. Back when Lysrius tried to recruit him, he had exposed this potential underbelly, but he had only been speculating. Now, he was even more certain. His ruined soul moved and he was about to leave this place when a pressure fell from above. It was powerful, more powerful than anything that Silas had ever felt before. Hand over the Clipsian and you may go. Orion's voice came from above, indifferent and commanding. He carried an icy cold that matched the crystals that seemed to coat his hair. Orion Stormveil. Level, 21. Orion frowned as he felt Silas scan him. It wasn't the scan that was the problem, but rather that he felt Silas had actually succeeded in part. Just how powerful was his mental? He had felt that it was beneath him to even attempt to scan Silas, but when he acted, his pupils couldn't help but constrict. Silas Grimblade. Level, 0. He only succeeded in part. A level 0. Orion was flawed, but by the time he recovered, Silas' body was already vanishing. The latter hadn't even taken Orion's threat seriously. The only chance Orion had of getting Silas to do what he wanted was intimidation and preying on Silas' ignorance. Unfortunately for him, Silas was aware that if Orion actually made a move, even if he managed to kill Silas, he would die soon after under the system's wrath. Orion had been prepared for this and had a death guard of sorts that would act in his stead. But what he didn't expect was for Silas to be so decisive in completely ignoring him. Then he had been stunned by Silas' stats, or rather lack of them, and he forgot to hand out the order. By the time everything was settled, Silas was gone. Orion stood in silence for a long while. However, he had long since regained his calm. Find out which world he is from. We will need to be ready to deal with it, he said calmly. Then, without so much as another word to his fiancée, his ship rose into the air and vanished over the horizon. Brisa and Aeroina looked to one another, their silence speaking 1,000 words. Silas appeared at the bottom of a lake and almost immediately frowned. One would think that he was thinking about Orion's intentions, but that was only a small bit at the back of his mind. That was because something else caught his attention immediately. Why was this lake so cold? All things considered, the ice poison lake should have felt like warm tap water to him at worst by now, considering his new stats and his upgraded affinity. But Silas' pupils constricted. I lost 4 months. This time, Silas was using the system to measure the time that passed, taking advantage of its date and time being synced to Earth. I see. The last time Silas lost such a large chunk of time it was because of the Slithering Madness dungeon. At first, he thought it was just an odd quirk of the dungeon, but what if that dungeon and this one both transported him away from Earth? He would have no way of knowing one way or another. In that case, was Earth in an accelerated time warp as well as being targeted from so many sides? Silas couldn't help but feel the walls caving in. These things were so far above his pay grade he didn't even understand how it could be possible. And worse than that, what about Earth was truly so valuable to be worth all this effort? Now that he thought about it, how were the Clipsians so powerful? And if the Dogons were their rivals, how had Earth produced 2 such powerful races of beings despite only being a grade 10 bronze world? Things weren't adding up, and the more he learned, the more pressure he felt. Silas' jaw set and he shot up to the surface. Bang! He landed on the water, his clothing nowhere to be seen. He had no choice but to take out a sealskin beast skirt from one of the male Clipsians and put it on while the rest of his skin glistened with chilly waters. His eyes sharply scanned the region and he found about as much as he would have expected considering he had been gone for 4 months. The entire landscape had changed. But what was even more troublesome was that he couldn't afford to return to Castlemaine now, not when he had no idea how things had changed on that side, and more importantly, what Lucius might have done in his absence from the Grimblades. Chapter 431, Legendary Paths Might. Minutes later, Silas was still standing on the icy lake. However, he now had one Arctic King Bear in his right hand and an Arctic King Cobra in his left. Blood dripped down from his fingers and drizzled into the lake, forming crystal shards of violet blood as they froze over. Both were level 19s, and they didn't last very long in his hands at all. Silas raised up the Arctic King Bear and squeezed down. Pa. Its head shattered into a rain of blood. Though, while it looked like he had done it with pure strength, it was instead because of Winter's Edge. In a region of such high ice ether concentration, the gene talent was far stronger. What Silas also noticed was that it flowed much more smoothly in the past, likely because of a combination of his dual-class constitution and the fact he had gotten rid of Blade Aura, giving him far more space to maneuver. Slowly, Silas raised up the Arctic King Cobra. The snake wreathed, but its eyes were clearly pulsing with fear. Silas had been gone for a quarter year, and it was clear that while these beasts were more intelligent than normal, it wasn't to the point of truly being human-like. Though, honestly, even for humans, such a time was already enough for them to forget. Silas will bore down and the Arctic King Cobra had its ability to resist fall to nothing. Your will has completely suppressed less than Arctic King Cobra greater than. Contract of subservience has been formed. A taming contract has been formed. Contracts. 1. Basilisk King, LV5. 2. Nosfaline Tideborn, LV6. 3. Arctic King Cobra, LV19. Arctic King Cobra. Status, injured. Loyalty, 9/10. Skills. Greater than Arctic King's Domain. Greater than Chilling Scythe. Greater than Arctic Howl. Gene Talents. Greater than Fleshly Swallow, Dormant. You have subdued a beast of common lineage. 10 free experience earned. Arctic King Cobra, FFF. Level, 19. Physical, 580. Mental, 651. Will, 603. Silas took a breath as a large amount of information filled his mind. Interesting. The history of the Arctic King Cobra was far shorter. It was a beast native to Earth and seemed to have only mutated into existence thanks to this ice poison pool. But what was fascinating was how they had gotten here in the first place. According to the ice poison venom pouch introduction he had read back in the Nexus, the Arctic King Cobras had evolved first and then migrated to cooler regions. That made sense. After all, snakes were cold-blooded creatures, they couldn't handle the cold unless a mutation occurred first. So, Silas had accepted this explanation without much pushback. However, according to his one-kind-for-me legendary path, this wasn't what happened at all. Someone created them on purpose. And they did it in order to protect the dungeon down below. Silas looked toward the dungeon, his eyes narrowing. There was only one group that could do this. Well, that wasn't exactly true. But, Silas was still more than 90% certain, given the information he had now, that the culprits were Asriel and whoever was backing him. In all likelihood, it was related to the system city that was nearby. But why? This isn't the only oddity. How did Orion know that I would come out with Eclipsian? How did Lauren know that Kassarai had the luck necklace? How did Lysarius know where the paradise portal would appear? He had run into such situations many times in this world by now, situations where his enemies seemed to have almost omnipotent knowledge about things they should have no understanding of. Silas wouldn't even be surprised if Gwiz City had only been targeting Kassarai so harshly precisely because they knew of her quest. 4 months. Losing so much time meant that not only did he have much less time to work with, but Kassarai was really riding a razor-thin margin. He had to make sure his family was all right and return as quickly as possible. If that meant falling out with Lucius, then so be it. There was a reason Silas hadn't made the decision to go nuclear on the Grimblade family just yet, and that was because he knew that Lucius' thoughts and that of the Grimblade family might not align. The Grimblades were looking for the best and most trustworthy heir, that's why they were choosing between those three. However, Lucius wanted to make sure that he was that heir. If the Grimblades were making the decisions, then there was no way they would choose to alienate Silas. At least not so overtly. Lucius was putting his foot down because that was his chosen approach, and because he felt that he had to. The more Silas struggled out of his control, the less of a chance he would have of maintaining the pecking order when the time came. However, 4 months or not, Silas had long since slipped out of his control. Silas turned back to the Arctic king cobra. It had been chosen by the person that forced its evolution precisely because of its high earth-and-average intellect and its high constitution. However, this person had neglected one thing. The king character of the Arctic king cobra. The Arctic king cobra was similar to the clandestine apes, but for completely different reasons. The clandestine apes adapted to any extremes, but the Arctic king cobra suppressed all extremes. Meaning, Silas pressed a finger to the forehead of the Arctic king cobra and closed his eyes. He breathed in slowly and exhaled. If one could see inside the body of the Arctic king cobra, several of its genes were being rearranged, shifted, and changed. At the same time, genes from the Arctic king bear were rising up and fusing into it along with Silas' own personal ice poison runes. He had already felt a moment of clarity when he used insight on a mesmerics. But compared to that, it was leagues easier on a common beast. To the point where the complicated genes that Silas couldn't even begin to manipulate in the past were like clay putty in his hands. And in just 3 hours. Arctic Emperor Cobra, FFF+. Level, 19. Physical, 942. Greater than, Strength, 1075. Greater than, Constitution, 1023. Greater than, Dexterity, 790. Greater than, Speed, 821. Mental, 933. Greater than, Intelligence, 1523. Greater than, Wisdom, 831. Greater than, Charisma, 545. Will, 996. A subtle smile curled Silas' lip. It was that very same giddy feeling he used to get as a child when he completed a difficult puzzle. Long before they became too easy for him to care about anymore. The feeling of accomplishment was something he hadn't felt in a very long time. What truly made him happy wasn't the fact his intuition had worked so well. No, the reason he was so happy was because he was correct. When he first saw the list of legendary paths, he hadn't been sure which to choose. But after reading the cumulative total of all possible Beastmaster paths, he came to the conclusion of choosing for the invincible, one kind for me, and Taboo Bond, not because they were individually powerful, but because he knew that together they would be a truly monstrous combination. N-O-V-E-L-B-J-N.C. And now, he was proven more than correct. Without the insight talent one kind for me gave him, it would be impossible for him to see through such complicated runes at his level. But, without Taboo Bond, even if he could sense those genes, he wouldn't be able to directly change them. And even if he had those two talents, without the hibernation realm, it would take years for his new Arctic Emperor Cobra to adjust to its new evolution. But now, it wouldn't even take 5 minutes. With a wave of his hand, the Arctic Emperor Cobra vanished. It was time to return to the Grimblades. Chapter 432, Bloom. Silas practically glided across the surface of the snow. There was no point in summoning his blue cyclone horse because it was simply too weak. Its maximum speed wasn't even 400, but his own was now 500. Plus, this was a good opportunity to get more used to his new stats. In truth, he didn't have much to get used to at all. After experiencing extricate on so many physical and mental genes, even if his stats hadn't improved so much, his understanding about body control, and his own sense of self, was far beyond what most people of Earth could even fathom. Every stride was almost elegant as all the muscles of his body fired in unison. His tendons tensed, the fibers of his body pulsing all at once. Whether it was the pump of his arms or the flex of his ankles as they hit the ground, it was all in perfect harmony. The same parts of his foot hit the ground again and again, the angle of his arms and the almost careless looseness of his fists didn't shift in the slightest. He looked like a textbook representation of the perfect run. And he left a blur in his wake. Before, it had taken him over a day to make it here even while riding a mount. But in just a few hours this time, he was already seeing the endless snowy plains wane somewhat. The animals have become far more powerful. There hadn't been many level 10 beasts in this region when he first made his way through. They were powerful, like the mammoths, for example. But their levels weren't particularly high. However, on the run back, he had seen several above level 10. He was eager to know what level the best of humanity had reached by now. He wouldn't be surprised if it was pushing level 30, or worse. And that would certainly make the System City elites even more powerful as a result. After all, their levels were capped depending on the best Earth had to offer. Things had gotten more complicated. N-O-V-E-L-B-J-N.C. This was twice now he had gotten out far ahead, only to be reset by time. And unfortunately, like most things in this world, he couldn't control it. Still, it gave him confidence. They had a 7-month advantage on him, and he doubted they could pose a threat at all without their numbers advantage. The Africa continent portal should be in that direction, Silas thought to himself as he entered the forest of tall evergreens. The System City's there, and Lucia's city should be in that direction. They form a triangle between them. If I'm too careless and I run into a no man's land between them all, it could cause some trouble. But Silas cut right through. Although it didn't show on his face, he was feeling a bit antsy. If anything happened to his little sister, truthfully, he wasn't sure what he would do. Most of the time, he was so even-keeled and nothing fazed him. But it was hard to tell what would happen when he was pushed over the edge. Silas' ears twitched as he caught the sound of battle. Without hesitation, he bolted in that direction. With a leap, he stamped a foot against a tree trunk, shattering its bark before making it to a high branch in a single bound. He pressed down and leapt to the next tree, leaving a blur of emerald green in his wake as he cut his own weight in half. His speed became a fold more effective as he crossed dozens of meters with single pushes of his leg. The combination of his new physical stats and more powerful telekinesis was showing their worth in spades. It took him no more than half a minute to lock onto a battle that had been over a kilometer away. There was no doubt in Silas' mind that he could easily outpace a vehicle now, and in terms of agility, he would leave one in his dust. Bloom. It was a queer sort of coincidence, but the first people he ran into were none other than his pair of sibling handlers. Bloom brandished her spear, weaving in and out of Mark's defenses while the latter manned his shield. They were outnumbered, facing off against 6 opponents. But the opponents themselves were the oddities. That was because they were an odd mix of human look-alikes and demons. The demons were wolfmen, or werewolves, whichever or how to pass the difference didn't mean much to Silas. All he needed to know was that they stood on 2 digitigrade legs, had the heads of wolves, and thick tufts of fur that formed an almost sharp mane. And the human look-alikes. Sylphs. Silas was very sensitive to their auras now even though they were clearly restrained and in disguise. The slight blue aura he could see coming whenever they used ether was a dead giveaway. And they're over level 20 now. Silas thought about it for a moment, standing high in the trees. He pressed a palm against the thick bark, steadying himself as the branch beneath him swayed beneath his weight. He didn't particularly care about Bloom and Mark's life and death. In fact, he had already deduced that Bloom had probably caused more problems for him than not. She had seen through a lot of his secrets ahead of time, and she was clearly a powerful warrior as well as a trusted aide to Lucius. But on the other hand, he truly wasn't prepared to fall out with the Grimblades yet. At least not until he could find a method to bring his family under Casseret's care. Unfortunately, that would be far easier said than done. Somewhat. He already had a bit of a plan for that as well, though it would depend on Earth's current situation and how much the ether plane had fused with it. However, as Silas was thinking, the choice was made for him. A sylph suddenly looked up, locking eyes with him and unleashing the fastest arrow he had ever seen. Chapter 433, Hiding. The arrow was sudden and sharp, appearing before Silas so fast that the sound hardly registered at all. And yet, Silas reached out and grabbed it. The arrow viciously spun in his palms, but his ether skin turned it to ice. The spinning slowed beneath his ice poison runes and a cancerous growth of blue patterns raced across its surface. However, before his ice poison could turn it to ash, his scorned raps were first. P.A. The arrow exploded into a rain of fine powder, obscuring Silas' visage somewhat before fluttering down toward the ground. Okay, Silas thought silently as he stepped forward into empty air. He began plummeting from the skies, seemingly making himself a live target. The archer realized this quickly, but Silas was still a step faster. His gluttony seed activated first and deflected a powerful arrow to the side. Then he sent out a pulse of telekinesis that seemed to act as an extension of his arm, pushing him out of the way of a second. By the time he hit the ground, the archer hadn't had the chance to fire a third before he was obscured by Mark's figure. Silas raised a finger and the two arrows spiraling wildly in the air, the two that he had just dodged, were forcefully severed from the archer's control. The sylph's eyes widened, but Silas was too fast. Even without fusing with the Basilisk King, the physical of his telekinesis was over 600 now with madness activated. And it showed. The arrows whizzed through the air, curling so fast around the trees that the only one who spotted them was the archer who had fired them in the first place. Unfortunately, he couldn't speak nearly fast enough to communicate with the others. Bang! Bang! The heads of two wolfmen exploded, only for the bone axes they had been carrying to be easily plucked from the grips and spiral into the chests of two more of their companions. The eyes of the two remaining sylphs widened and they instantly sent out pulses of ether to block Silas' next round of telekinesis, but that did little to deter Mark, who sent out a pulse of his own. A shield bash attack countered, and Bloom's spear snaked through the air like a streaking silver star. Silas drew two fingers across the air and two normal less than chilling scythes rushed forward, causing enough of a distraction for the siblings to finish the job. As the last sylph fell, the two stood there gasping for breath. They were in quite a sorry state. Mark was covered in blood, presumably having had to take the bulk of the punishment for his sister. However, Silas could see that one of Bloom's wrists was terribly bruised and she had barely been putting any power into that arm. At a glance, it was clear that they were ambushed. But it couldn't be that simple, or else with the skills of these two, they wouldn't have been caught so flat-footed. Eventually, the siblings managed to finally look over at Silas. Truthfully, he looked a bit ridiculous by modern standards, or even logical standards, but there was no doubt that he was in the best shape of them all. He wore nothing but what looked like a soft, sealskin skirt. He didn't have any shoes on his feet or a shirt on his back. His gaze had an icy green hue to it, and although it felt like a trick of the light at first, the more they looked, the more certain they were that his eyes were well and truly glowing. Although only slightly. By comparison, the two of them were decked out in the best treasures and armor that money could buy at this point in the summoning. And somehow, they still felt inferior. They could feel Silas probe their stats, but they didn't even have the right to resist. Mark Grimblade, FF+. Level, 21. Bloom Grimblade, FFF. Level, 21. Silas looked at their stats in more detail. Other than the fact the grades seemed to have ticked up by 1, they really weren't that impressive. Bloom's best physical stat was her dexterity, but that was only 453 stat points, while her best stat overall, intelligence, was just barely over 500. By comparison, Mark's constitution was almost 600, but he didn't have another stat over 500. However, their stats weren't everything. Not only did these two also have blade aura, the first time Silas met Bloom, he had sensed her comprehension. Now, he could feel it even more clearly. On top of that, there was all the equipment they were wearing. Scanning them one by one, their stats were an average of over 600, with their best clearing 700. Mark's constitution, shield and armor included, was almost into the quadruple digits. By now, the gap between those with good equipment and without was becoming glaringly obvious. The siblings felt a little uncomfortable with Silas' stare. It was very rude to simply scan someone like this, but it also wasn't something that most could pull off. They had counter skills, mental protection treasures, and all sorts of other tricks and gadgets. But they seemed useless before Silas' eyes. Mark was the first to clear his throat. Silas, we've been wondering where you've been. Holy hell, you really saved our bacon this time. I was delayed by some matters and got stuck in a dungeon, Silas replied. I was only able to return now. The two nodded, but though he was telling the truth, Silas could also tell they didn't believe him. But this situation seems a bit odd, Silas continued. What happened? The two siblings looked toward one another and Mark sighed. It's a long story. We've really been getting fucked from all sides. Right now we're on a quest to secure a trade route, but as you might expect, things didn't exactly go as planned. Silas frowned inwardly. A trade route, that was most likely between Lucius City and the System City. But that attack was clearly headed by sylphs that should also be from the System City. Odd. These two were hiding something. Chapter 434, Multi-Quest. Let's finish securing the trade route, then. Silas replied. His expression didn't seem to give away anything, but he could see a twinkle in Bloom's eye that quickly became shock and confusion. Obviously, Profession had failed to work this time. But Silas didn't expose her. With Silas, the duo managed to finish their quest swiftly. Or rather, it could be said that if not for being ambushed, they would have never struggled with it in the first place. A trade route securing quest was separated into three aspects. The first was scouting, the second was marking, and the third was successfully completing one route. They were on the last leg, and if their cargo had suffered any damage, they would have failed. Luckily for them, the target of the sylphs wasn't their cargo. Or so it seemed. Silas' eyes scanned everything he could, taking note of as much information as possible, and he couldn't help but feel that it was impossible for it to be a coincidence. Maybe it was because he was aware that the sylphs were almost certainly in charge of the nearby System City, but he couldn't get out of his own head about it. Was it really natural for them to go so far out of their way to target a mere Bloom and Mark? In the past, Silas had felt a great deal of pressure from them. But now, he didn't even take them very seriously at all. He had a hard time believing that the sylphs would care to. But as they were finishing up the route, he got a notification that made his gaze flicker. You have begun to effect change on a multi-quest. Would you like to steal their destiny? I see. Silas had never heard of a multi-quest before, but on the way here, he had casually killed more than enough creatures with bronze genes. Madness Key, Treasure. A key leading to a fortune of madness. Detects other madness disciples and enlightens your path. Contains small spatial world within. Can answer one question in exchange for less than 2 bronzy genes. Curse status, Glutton. Less than 12 bronzy genes a day to maintain happiness. Requirements grow by the day. Less than 5 days remaining until hunger increases. Curse status, cannot be unequipped. The Madness Key had undergone quite a few evolutions since he survived against the Arctic Emperor Cobra. It had already been well over a month since then. Luckily, the Madness Key only counted time he personally experienced, or else he might truly be screwed this time. N-O-V-E-L-B-J-N.C, But, even so, it was already getting to the point where gathering so many genes might become troublesome. The good news was that it had stopped doubling, and for the last while, it had only been needing 2 extra bronze genes a week. Thanks to this, he found out what a multi-quest was quickly and confirmed his guesses. They came in 2 forms, one of which was somewhat similar to a chain quest, and another that was a bit more complex than that. The former essentially forced a quest onto a team of people, and each were given legs of the quest to complete. The quest would fail if everyone didn't complete their parts. The only difference between it and a chain quest was that the parts were completed simultaneously instead of in sequence. The latter were more complicated and sometimes even called multivariable quests to distinguish them. They were quests that could change objectives or alter the difficulty on the fly, somewhat like receiving alternative endings in a video game. Such quests were actually highly sought after because upon triggering some hidden requirements, it was possible to receive rewards far higher than the initial difficulty. But, likewise, it was also possible to complete a task far more difficult in exchange for little to nothing at all. The question was, which of these quests were the siblings on? And also, what would happen if he accepted? No matter what kind of multi-quest it was, there would be several legs of it, with many moving parts. If he stole the destiny of the whole quest, then how would he possibly complete it alone? Unless in this context stealing referred to forcefully integrating himself into the quest and gaining rewards anyway. Silas was curious, and honestly speaking, no matter what he did, the Grimblades would be antsy. So why not? This time, Silas accepted, and there was a sudden warp. Bloom and Mark frowned subconsciously as though they felt something they couldn't quite explain, but their reaction wasn't nearly as fierce as it should have been had they known exactly what happened. Multi-quest received. Madness Key Gluttony will go into dormancy for less than 14 days. Hunger will be reduced by 100% permanently. Upon failure. Madness Key Gluttony will double. Timer for hunger will reduce by 50% for less than 28 days. Silas was surprised when he read these penalties and potential rewards, because they were identical to what he would receive if he succeeded in his legendary chain quest. It seemed that either this would always be the result no matter what, or this multi-quest had the potential to truly be something special. Whichever one it was, he would likely find out very soon. Evergreen Territory Claim Multi-Quest. The Evergreen Winter Forest is home to 223 demon villages, 3 system cities, and 2 mysterious powers. It is not well known for its vegetation, but what it lacks in life and vitality, it makes up for in precious metals. Controlling this territory means access to a wealth of mineral and ore deposits. However, this region is faced with a problem. It is the mirror of a continent with climate opposite to its own. Whereas it is dry and cold, its earth coordinates are wet and hot. This disruption results in a clash of ether that could potentially ruin both lands. Lay claim to Evergreen, realign its coordinates, and claim its wealth for yourself. Leg 003. Greater than clear trading route. I see. This wasn't a quest. This was an all-out war. But the details simply didn't matter because with this, Lucius wouldn't be able to kill him even if he was capable. Chapter 435, Originator. Leg 003 cleared. Greater than, return to quest originator. When Silas read the word originator, he felt something stir inside of him. N-O-V-E-L-B-J-N.C. On the feeling soon became far more substantial than just a vague feeling. Path of the progenitor activated. Subordinate path sensed. Precedence overruled. Would you like to take control of this multi-quest? Silas' eyes narrowed. He followed after the siblings, so neither could see his expression. Though, that would not have been likely to help them at all. After thinking about it, Silas chose to reject it for now. Path of the progenitor. That came from the legendary quest. He didn't receive any reward related to it, so he had neglected it only for it to come up in the most expected of ways now. Silas didn't even bother to attempt to ask the madness key. He could already feel from the slight intention alone that it was a taboo. But he could also feel that this path of the progenitor, while he had yet to truly earn it just yet, was extremely powerful. It wasn't yet time to pick this nuclear option. He would have to see what the state of Lucius City was first. After all, he needed more from this place than just knowledge that his family was all right. In a few hours, they could see a city on the horizon. Compared to the last time Silas had seen it, it had undergone many changes. The thick logs that made up its exterior walls seemed stained with black ash and exuded a far stronger aura. It seemed to even have a slight deterrence that Silas could feel through one kind for me would be effective against his serpentous companions. It was a beast ward, a perpetual one etched into the very walls. Judging by its strength, it would work for at least 2 or 3 kilometers. It would definitely keep this region safe, at least from beasts. They passed through several outposts, and Silas could feel the ether fluctuations as they quickly sent information back. Soon, there was a small team of 3 rushing toward them. But this team had a man that didn't look like he had done a day of exercise in his life. It wasn't that he was fat, but rather that he was, well, soft, for lack of a better descriptor. He wasn't skinny enough to be lanky or fat enough to be obese. But he certainly had a belly and his body was almost lumpy in its constitution. The wispy grey hairs on his head went to confirm just how much things had changed. This might have been a war, but this was no longer a frontier of just warriors alone. They had definitely expanded in more ways than one. Gasping for breath, the lumpy man came to a stop. "Is it finished?" he said between breaths. "Yes, the route is secured." "I understand," the man huffed, settling himself. He stood up straight and turned a glance toward Silas. Silas could feel that he was being observed. For a moment, he thought of whether he should block or not, but when he sensed something in the distance, he chose the former. The lumpy man suddenly staggered backward, blood running down his nose as his eyes rolled into the back of his head. Mark quickly reached out and caught him. "Wilfred, what's wrong?" Clink, clink, clank. At that moment, in the far-off distance, the seemingly empty city walls became lined with artillery. Silas knew what he was seeing. These should be the works of a certain old English speaker, Archibald. It seemed that now that he was getting far better equipment, what he could create was also likewise shocking. Even a casual ballista bolt from these units would carry over 2000 attack. If it was cranked at the expense of durability, Scylla's less-than-master scouting told him that it wouldn't be impossible to hit 3000 attack a few times. The gates of the city shook from a partial open position to a half-open one, and a small troop of a dozen marched out. At the same time, on the city walls, another group appeared. This one had Lucius and 3 others, 2 of which Scylla's recognized. The first was Nathan, Lucius' first pick and the self-created billionaire who had created several successful companies thanks to his AI algorithm. The second was Lucius' third pick, the one he took after Scylla's. It was a young woman, and she was a historian who went by Ivy, if he recalled correctly. She was somewhat special, but he had only heard vague retellings of what she specialized in from conversations others had spoken about. He wasn't exactly sure what made her worthy of being picked by Lucius, but all things considered, he didn't know much about Nathan as well. He wasn't the one who carried all their information and made decisions about where to draft them, after all. The troop of a dozen on the ground was quick to surround them, and Bloom and Mark seemed to understand that this was all for Scylla's as well. They distanced themselves from him, and the 2 guards that had come with Wilfred were likewise on high alert as they unsheathed their weapons. Scylla's wasn't actually too surprised about all of this. If it was possible to hide Scylla's feats, then he might have been willing to pretend like Scylla's was on a mission he had sent him out for. But not only was that not in his personality, but that ship had also long since sailed. Scylla's bet that while he was away, some other shocking truth bombs had fallen. If he got merits for killing a quasi-bronze beast, he would have certainly gotten another for killing the second. And if merits were about contributions to Earth, then defeating the Sylphs would certainly be another. Especially after his dungeon was tampered with. Scylla's was more than just a little bit correct. Although he was no longer the sole possessor of the merit list. The distance between himself and everyone else might as well have been an abyss. And on top of that, unlike the Madness Key, treasures given by the merit leaderboard, or leaderboards in general, were decided by Earth's timeline, not Scylla's personal experience of it. Scylla's looked up from the approaching troops and his gaze met Lucius. Chapter 436, Lording. Scylla's could imagine that from Lucius' perspective, things had spun too far out of control. What he wanted to know now was just how much unilateral control Lucius had over the situation. Right now, it could be said that he wasn't truly facing off against the Grimblades, but rather Lucius himself. That said, they weren't necessarily mutually exclusive. For example, Archibald was a huge boon to Lucius, and the latter was clearly using him now. However, the appearance of Archibald had also allowed Lucius to be rewarded by the Grimblades. At least from what Scylla's had deduced. So where was the line, exactly? The Grimblades would certainly also be aware of his feats, so how far would they allow Lucius to go? All things considered, Lucius was the son of his grandfather's brother, making him Scylla's cousin, though once removed. Compared to the other Brown family callbacks, Scylla's was actually quite close to the main line. In fact, had his grandfather not left to raise his father would be in Lucius' position right now, and there would be 4 heirs instead of 3. That made all of this even more complicated because how the family treated him might actually bleed into how they wanted to treat his grandfather. Would they stand by a family decision made so long ago even if it turned out to be wrong? Or would they show flexibility? Then there was the most important part. On the one hand, Lucius might be inclined to not take things too far because the family would likely see him as a valuable asset. But on the other hand, precisely because the family knew, the fact that Lucius hadn't controlled and managed him properly could be seen as a ding to his candidacy for heir, and as such, Lucius might decide to take things too far precisely to prove that he could be managed. All of these thoughts were swirling around in Scylla's head. The number of layers to the situation was deep, and he knew that it was no longer about simple or surface-level actions. In fact, depending on what Lucius' exact thought processes were, even the same action could be either stupid or highly intelligent depending. For example, if he chose to attack Scylla's now, was it because of his ego, or was it a play at something more complex than that? As for what the true answer would be, even Scylla's was curious. Lucius might be unaware, but despite the pressure in the surroundings, Scylla's had the means to end this right here and now. All he had to do was point out his new role in their multi-quest. But, he wanted to see this first. Take him down, Lucius said lightly. Detain him. A middle ground choice, Well, that would likely depend. Silas thought about how to deal with the situation as those around him moved. Much of their equipment seemed even better than Bloom and Mark's, and he could even see that they were getting a boost similar to his Gwiz City titles just by being here. Luckily, as a general, he could leave Gwiz City for however long he wanted. Otherwise, that 4-month disappearance would have truly screwed him over. Many thoughts swirled in Silas' head. Should he assert dominance? Should he try to fight back and then feign a loss? Should he not fight back at all? Honestly speaking, he was leaning toward not fighting at all, not only for the sake of preserving what last bit of facade there was between the two of them, but also because he wasn't naive enough to feel like he was invincible. He was fine with being detained by Kasari because it had, 1, given him time to meditate on something he had wanted to meditate on anyway, and 2, because he knew she would never actually harm him. But who was to say what Lucius might be capable of after catching him? He wasn't to the point where he was omnipotent just yet. However, tearing off that last layer of facade would also put his family in harm's way. Silas took a breath, his gaze flickering. Unfortunately, he still didn't have enough information about what was happening to make the most informed decision. And in that case, Silas' gaze suddenly sharpened. It was time to gamble. Bloom and Mark stood to the side, but they were still the first to react. This reaction wasn't to attack Silas, but instead in realization of what was happening. Bang! A forceful wave of telekinesis spread out in a booming cadence. Less than Arctic Howl mutant greater than, his new Etherflow gene talent, and his telekinesis formed a net altogether. The coming troop was frozen in one moment, and then blown away in the next. Each one was toppled off of their feet as Silas stood in place, the harsh, cold winds whipping around him wildly as winter's edge pulsed and shrank continuously as though it was ready to deploy at any moment. The temperature in the surroundings plummeted as Silas crossed his arms over his chest. Blue runes danced around him, cracking the ground in a new sheet of ice and spreading out. Like a cancer. Silas didn't move, but he continued to stand in silence, his gaze flickering as though he was still thinking about whether he made the right move or not. However, when he did decide on something, he never hesitated. Scales began to grow along his body, etched in black and gold. His aura surged, becoming even more powerful. Clenching a fist, he uncrossed his arms and took a single step forward. A tall set of illusory, golden slit eyes appeared to his back, lording over the world. Less than psychedelic punch greater than. He was easily 50 meters from the wall, but in that moment, it felt like he might as well be standing right in front of Lucius. Bang! The first was too fast, too shocking, too powerful. Before anyone could react, the air shattered apart as the sound of what felt like an exploding bomb resonated in their ears. Chapter 437, Etherflow. Lucius' pupils constricted as he froze in place. His head slowly turned to the side, a slight sheen of cold sweat on his back. He had prepared for everything, but he had never thought even a single time that Silas would be able to attack from so far away without even so much as a bow. And worse than that. A ballista, expensive and painstakingly crafted by Archibald, was blasted apart as though a ticking time bomb had just gone off in its internal structure. Bits and pieces, shards and gears, blew apart in all directions as Silas slowly lowered his fist. However, what was even more shocking than that was that the top of the wall had a trench torn out through it as though a giant had suddenly come from above and taken a bite. They all knew exactly how tough that wall was, but now it had been blown to bits from a single strike. Silas' black scales slowly faded, his eyes twinkling and his arm throbbing. Even after all the upgrades, his arm had actually still become useless after just a single use of less than psychedelic punch greater than, but he knew what the problem was. Though, it wasn't really a problem at all. His will had grown considerably, and now the beast totem he could visualize was even more insane than before. Not only that, but his beast totem actually seemed to grow more powerful after he contracted more serpentis. There seemed to be some relationship between the two. But even this was just one aspect. The next issue was that Etherflow was simply too powerful. More powerful than Silas ever expected. It seemed that the gap between bronze and silver was no joke at all. Before, basic Etherflow was capable of scaling with his punching skill, not skill. Meaning, the better his boxing technique, the stronger basic Etherflow was. When he first got it, his fists were only boosted by a measly 5%. But by the time he got his unfused boxing comprehension up to FFF+, his fists had been able to carry a whole 60% boost to his strength when he was firing out punches with basic Etherflow. Given his previously weak physical stats, that was huge. And it was only more exaggerated now that his physical stats had finally begun to truly catch up with the rest of the world. And even better when his fusion with the Basilisk King was added on top of that. But now, there was a full 100% boost. This didn't sound like much, and comparatively speaking, it didn't truly highlight the difference between bronze and silver. And that was true. But that was also because the surface level boost to his punching power was just the tip of the iceberg. Not only did he not get a 100% boost, the cost of his ether had plummeted off a cliff. Before, it would cost at least 0.1 ether units to fire off a punch. But now he could send out at least 10 for that cost, which was absolutely absurd considering the current state of his intelligence. Essentially, he could fire off over 4,000 punches before his ether truly began to wane. And yet that still wasn't all. Just now, when his fist appeared, he had freely controlled it to increase in size. Etherflow. Ether comes naturally to you, even when it's outside of your body. Your ability to extend your ether away from your core, attaching it to objects to control and wield, far exceeds others. You have now reached a new step of mastery. Basic Etherflow had always been about control, but there had likewise been many diminishing returns with said control as well. But the upgrade from basic Etherflow to Etherflow seemed to have done away with much of that. Silas could now directly control the area of effect of his fists. He could expand it and make his power disperse over several meters, or he could tighten it, shrinking his fist size by half and concentrating the strength into an even tighter point. But that wasn't all. If he wanted, he wouldn't have to disperse the power at all. In fact, just for a little more additional ether, he could keep the effectiveness of his fist the same and ratchet up the area of effect. Essentially, he could throw fists like he was a giant, making him akin to the large creatures of Earth and their ridiculous physicals at simply the cost of a little more ether. And it showed. His strength was basically 700 with the Basilisk King added on top. There was a 100% boost from Etherflow and what must have been an almost plus 200% boost from less than psychedelic punch greater than, which before had only given him a little over a plus 100% boost. Together, that punch alone had over 4,000 attack. Even higher than the absolute upper limit of what those fancy new ballista could do on their own. And although Silas could only throw such a punch twice, not only was he far more accurate and flexible, he believed that he had proven his point adequately enough. He wasn't trapped here with them. They were trapped here with him. And any one of them within a 50-meter range could die instantly if they weren't careful. Of course, by doing this he had also exposed the fact that he could, which would make them ready and wary for the next time. But there were also many things that he hadn't shown he could do. They had no idea that on top of fusing with the Basilisk King, he had another contract. Even though he couldn't fuse with them at the same time, that didn't mean that he couldn't summon them to fight. He could fuse with the Basilisk King on one hand, and have a beast a step from quasi-bronze wreak havoc on the surroundings. And all of that before he even used his greatest trump, the multi-quest. All of this was the reason Silas had chosen to take such a step. What happened next would depend on Lucius. Chapter 438, I Understand. Silas stood in a calm silence, the shuddering air and the echoing boom. The only proof of his earlier action. The troop of warriors shuddered as they broke free of the temporary freeze, but many of them were still covered in an eerie, stubborn poison. Their attempts to break through were taking up a large amount of ether a second, and each one felt as though their lives were no longer in their hands. Of course, they also had no idea just how much ether and wisdom it was taking up for Silas to continuously press them with his freeze rune, and they weren't going to, either. The silence was palpable. Lucius and Silas looked toward one another, the former having already calmed, the latter having been indifferent all the while. If there was one thing that could be said about Lucius, it was that he was worthy of being a Grimblade heir candidate. He had been through a lot, and the elasticity of his mind was extremely high. What would you like to do here, Silas? Lucius' voice was steady. He didn't have to make any underlying threats clear. He was sure that Silas was smart enough to think of them all. Wasting his time doing so would not only be a waste of everyone's, it would also lower his standing even further in the eyes of those here. Silas raised an internal eyebrow. He didn't expect that Lucius would ask such a question, but he could also see through Lucius' confidence as well. This was a conversation they should be having in private, however, Lucius had chosen to have it here. There were two ways to look at that. Either he wanted to take this as an opportunity to try and display that he still had control of the situation. Or, he felt that if he asked Silas to come in, too many things could go wrong. Silas could reject, which would force them back to square one and make it into a battle of pure strength. In such a situation, Silas would likely have a high chance of escaping given the strength he had just displayed. From Lucius' perspective, this was the smartest way to go about things. He wouldn't force things to the end, and assuming negotiations went well, it would allow those that remained to see that he still had cards to play in his hand. But it was a risk. This action also subconsciously put Silas on the same level as him in the eyes of those smart enough to see it. By the same token, it pushed Silas toward the center. Did he have the ability to negotiate? Did he know what to say, and when? He had been a professor, and by comparison, Lucius had been sealing multi-million-dollar deals since he was in his late teens. Now, as a man approaching his mid-40s, just how much experience did he have? Only to return to the Grimblades, Silas said calmly. And what does that mean to you? Exactly what I said. Lucius didn't seem perturbed by Silas' words. The family works based on a series of laws and regulations. We are a family second and an organization first. We do not have the luxury to be anything else, not with the fate of our world on the line. I asked you to return 4 months ago and was willing to give you a several-week grace period. However, this sort of delay was unacceptable. You do not seem to take me very seriously at all. So why should I allow you to return? I was stuck in a dungeon, Silas replied. Lucius' gaze flickered. He thought about the changes to the merit leaderboard and felt that Silas was likely telling the truth. Also, even after being gone for these 4 months, I would say that I've still contributed more than almost anyone here. Either subconsciously or not, Silas sent a glance toward the trench he had just dug out of the top of the black log wall. Lucius remained silent for a moment before he turned to Nathan. Nathan, what is our policy about dungeons? N-O, vel, B, J-N.C, They must be reported and diagnosed before a team is selected to go in. In the case that there is no other choice but to enter the dungeon, a detailed report is to be taken and all treasures, gene cores, or items of value found should be taken stock of after the fact. Once this is completed, the individual or team that entered under duress will be allowed to keep 30% of the items, as opposed to the 50% they would get to keep had the dungeon been reported. They will also not get first choice as they would in the latter case. Lucius nodded without much of a change in his expression. However, Nathan continued, this policy was only implemented after the disappearance of Silas, here. So he was not made aware. And since he has been stuck in such a dungeon for 4 months, he also entered first, too. Lucius nodded, not seeming to mind Nathan's words. In fact, one would have almost thought they had time to rehearse it all. That is a fair assessment of the situation. In that case, the rule can be waived, but please keep this in mind in the future. However, there are other rules that cannot be waived. Nathan. Indeed, there are certain taxes and tariffs that must be enforced. In addition, Nathan sent a glance toward the broken wall and the shattered ballista. Borrowed equipment that ends up damaged beyond the durability allowances must be paid for in full. Either the repair cost in the case of a durability issue, or in replacement cost in the case of complete destruction. It didn't take a genius to understand what was happening. A retreat for advancement. They couldn't allow Silas to come back for nothing even if they had no choice. It was righteous extortion. I understand, Silas replied calmly. It would be impossible to conquer the Evergreen territory without such rules. I have no issues. They were simple words, but Lucius felt his heart leap to his throat. Chapter 439, Merit, Originator, and Progenitor. There was no one who should know the name of the quest. He hadn't shared it with anyone. The names the system gave to things were variable. It was based on a combination of what people used and sometimes hidden mechanisms that were far more complex. For example, Silas' first name was decided by the system purely based on what his legal name was. However, his true legal name was Silas Brown, so why did it appear as Silas Grimblade to the system? He was certainly not the only one who was experiencing such a thing. And most importantly for this case, it wasn't just something people dealt with either. There were certainly various names that people called this place. Some named it after the large number of dire wolves in the region, some extended the name of the Arctic Circle further north to this region, and there were some that even called it Evergreen. But the last was not only the most rare of the names, to combine it with the word, territory, was too on the nose for Silas to have said it by accident. Lucius had only learned of the official name of this region after receiving this quest. It was simply impossible for Silas to know it unless he was privy to the quest as well. Unless there was another wild coincidence that he wasn't aware of. Not sure what to do, Lucius subconsciously checked his quest notifications to ensure that he hadn't mistaken something. But that was when he saw something that shook him to his core. When had Silas become a part of the quest's contingent? He was the quest originator, he hadn't approved of such a thing. How was this possible? There was no denying it. Lucius was shaken. And he realized now that the calmness of Silas' reaction wasn't just because he was rich, and it wasn't because he felt like he could get away with what he wanted no matter what Lucius said either. It was because he already had Lucius by the balls and he knew it. Lucius knew more about the merit leaderboard than most, and it was in large part because of it that he didn't dare to take things too far with Silas. Still, he had begun to doubt it somewhat. The number of merits Silas had already accumulated simply didn't make any sense. It made one feel as though the merit leaderboard was broken or that Silas had found some sort of loophole to exploit. However, right now, he was forced to believe it. The merit leaderboard was one that measured the contributions one made to their home world. The strongest worlds across the universe were all under the control of one power. Those that were split between several factions tended to be the weakest of them. The merit leaderboard, in its simplest form, was an easy method of dividing resources and the focus of a world across factions and their leaders. Essentially, it was a method of avoiding all-out conflict and focusing on helping a world to evolve, the true main purpose of the system. However, it was also said that when there was a by far and away king or queen, the purpose of the merit leaderboard had a chance to change and could provide an opportunity. A merit war that would decide the emperor of a world. Of course, Lucius knew too little about such things. In fact, even the ancestors of the Grimblades knew next to nothing, and these were just tidbits he had picked up on. What he didn't know was that it would take far more than some stars of merit to trigger such a thing. For one had to actually be the owner or highly related to the owner of a city large enough and strong enough to lay claim to an entire world in the first place, and that was just part of the issue. All Lucius did know was that having a large amount of merit allowed you to gain the favor of the system and skirt some of its rules. At least in regard to events of high importance to the future of a world. And what was more important than the future ruler of a territory of the ether plane? Not only that, but the merging of this territory with Earth was going to make or break the foundation of two highly important areas, N-O-V-L-B-J-N.C, There were few things that would be more important to the system than this. But what Lucius didn't know was that it was even worse than this. The title of Originator, which Lucius was temporarily granted for this quest, was fluid. It could change, only lasted for a short time, and was only applied to highly specific events like this one. However, the title of Progenitor represented something wholly different. It ranked even higher than what it would mean to become the emperor of a world. A progenitor could only appear before a world completed its summoning. They were an existence akin to the ancestor of a world. Should a progenitor be successfully born, their path of progress would become inextricably linked to the world. On the one hand, this meant that a world's fate, whether good or bad, would directly be tied to this progenitor. However, by the same token, it would open up a secondary system, one designed not just to advance the gene state of a person, but of an entire world. Unlike people, the talent of a world was practically set. It could be downgraded depending on external action, and it could be upgraded slightly with a great deal of effort, but such things took an obscene amount of resources and time that could only be counted in generations. However, progenitors unlocked the system's favor, allowing them to level up their worlds like they would themselves. The path of the progenitor had been opened up to Silas, meaning, the day he managed to gain Earth's complete favor would be the day he was nigh invincible while standing in its midst. And now, with a simple sentence, he had barely shown Lucius a part of his cards and forced him into a corner in a single move. Chapter 440, Communication. Lucius gave Silas a deep look. He was already aware that he had been outmaneuvered. There was no getting out of this. The quest was too important to him. So, he smiled. I'm glad that we have been able to come to an understanding, and equally as glad that you managed to make it back from such a difficult dungeon. We can iron out the details later. Lucius looked over the wall and toward those manning the gates. Open up the gates. Be prepared for battle. The subtle words seemed to be a signal to everyone else. This, of course, wasn't a green light to attack Silas, but rather implied that he was letting things go because they were in a precarious situation and needed to be a single unit without internal strife. It wasn't long before Silas was escorted into Lucius' city, and though he wasn't given any official positions just yet, judging by his accommodations, it was less because Lucius wouldn't and more that it just wasn't the right time. His new living abode was simple, but it had the first instance of running water that Silas had seen outside of system cities on the ether plane, and it was almost too big for just a single person, being over 500 square feet. Silas had many things he wanted to do, but he chose to wait. And as expected, it wasn't long before he was escorted to see Lucius once more. This time, in a much more private setting. The meeting was too surface level to bother to recount. Lucius spent much of the time hedging and beating around the bush, but Silas gave nothing away at all. However, the two of them weren't naive men. They realized that this situation hardly made them allies, and it was likely that the both of them would be watching their backs from now on. Right now, Silas seemed to have Lucius by the balls, but any intelligent person would see that it was far more even than it seemed. That was because Lucius' pull in the real Grimblade family was much greater than anything Silas could manage. In fact, Silas had no presence in the real Grimblade family at all. Because of this, Silas had no idea how much Lucius' word could impact his family. While he held Lucius' future in his hands, Lucius likewise had cards that were difficult for him to see through. Who knew what kind of improvement Lucius had made in this time? Silas had to find a way to get in touch with a Nexus soon, because that was the only way he could both claim his accumulated rewards and check to see the current state of the world. He would just have to hope for now that Kasari could hold out on her own. That said, the meeting wasn't entirely fruitless. Silas returned to his living abode and began preparing to set out once again. It was already time to complete the next leg of the multi-quest, but Silas had insisted on having a method of contacting his family first. Now he had one. That was the good news. The bad news was that Lucius would obviously place limiters. This device could only be used to connect with one other person's system and it was permanent. In addition, it cost a large number of ether stones to use properly. For just a 1-minute call, it required 10 ether stones. And to make matters worse, this amount couldn't be replaced with ether. It specifically required the refined state of ether stones to work, unlike his transmutation beast skin. Silas wasn't sure what the difference was, and he didn't want to particularly find the time to find out. Right now, it wasn't at the top of his priority list. He fiddled around with the device in his hands a bit, realizing that it was a bit more complicated than he thought. For example, how would he pick out the system he wanted to connect to in a sea of people? This seemed to be a bit of a double-edged sword. Either he would fail to contact his family and that would be a positive for Lucius, not to mention an extra card. Or he would succeed and expose more of his strengths. Right now though, he didn't care because he simply didn't fear Lucius. Although he hadn't scanned Lucius' stats, he felt next to no pressure standing before him, and he trusted his will. Once Silas started using Rune Soul, the process was even easier than expected. All he had to do was sort by name. The good thing about the system having everybody's name was that it likewise documented it all. On top of that, Grimblade was a unique family name tied to their genes, making it so that there were only a few thousand people in the world with this name. So many Grimblades, I guess their reserves run deeper than I even previously assumed. Soon, Silas found the names of his family and double-checked that there was no one else who shared the same name. After some further thought, although it was a bit silly, he chose to connect with his little sister first. His thought process was simple: she was probably the last person Lucius thought he would use this opportunity on. And Lucius also had no idea how smart his little sister was either. She was far less disciplined than himself, but Silas had a feeling that his little sister's raw IQ might be higher than his own. Unfortunately, the little munchkin took the world even less seriously than her elder brother did. Soon, there was a flicker and an image formed in Silas's eyes. Much like his notification pop-ups, he was fairly sure that he was the only one that could see it. In fact, he should be the only one that could hear it too. Silas. Alara's little face blinked in surprise and then her eyes lit up. Silas.